Hello, Deb.
Hi, Craig.
Hi. Welcome to Safetrac's Compliance Corner podcast. This is our very first episode.
It is. We're pretty excited.
I'm very excited actually about this.
Yeah. We actually think that we might be the first compliance podcast in Australia.
I think we are. From research, it looks like I've done a Google, and Google says that we are the first. Please, audience, let us know if that's incorrect.
But we are going to be the best.
We're 100% going to be the best with the best special guests.
That's right. We do have some good special guests coming out.
We do.
But we're going to make you wait.
Okay,
right?
yes.
Shall we wait?
We are.
Make them wait?
We're definitely going to make them wait, yes.
Okay. So we've got an awesome special guest for today.
We have. It's a big surprise.
Yep. But you'll have to listen to all of this before you get
You
to
are,
it.
yeah. Specifically for the algorithm to show that you have listened to a significant chunk of this podcast.
But today, and the point of today's podcast is we're going to be talking about what we believe is the number one topic in HR circles, at least at the moment, and on most compliance radars, which is psychosocial health.
Yep.
And psychosocial hazards in the workplace and changes to laws and what companies need to be doing to be compliant with the new laws.
Yep.
Craig, you're new to Australia.
I am. I'm new to Australia. I'm new to compliance.
Should we start off by introducing ourselves?
I think that's probably right. I was about to say, rather than me just playing dumb, it turns out I probably am dumb on this topic. I am only 6 months into the role and 6 months into Australia. I come from a little old place called the UK, much colder than it is over here. But
we love it because you sound quite posh.
Do I sound posh?
Yeah, you do.
You think I sound posh? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm fine with sounding posh.
Yeah.
I sound exotic. My wife, who is Australian, spent most of her time in the UK being exotic, and she said to me last night, she said she's disappointed that she is no longer the exotic one.
Yeah, I get that. I lived in the States for a while and everyone thought that I sounded just fantastic.
Fantastic.
And now I'm just boring Deb. So yeah,
there's probably a psychosocial health thing with making impressions of people, isn't there?
But it's nice to be exotic for some of our lines.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it. Look, I'm 6 months here and I'm having a great time. But in terms of compliance, obviously I've worked for some larger organisations before. I've done some training before. I've done training on joining Safetrac as well. Although I've done the training and I kind of have a grasp of how not to be non-compliant, I probably don't have the biggest grasp. So this is actually quite a good format where I am hopefully learning some things that the audience might not know, or the audience might already know and are shouting down the camera at me, trying to tell me all about compliance. So we thought this would be a really good format for a podcast.
Well, it is interesting because I'm a lawyer by trade, so I've probably been in some aspect of compliance for most of my life.
Yep.
I ended up working in tech companies overseas for many years and then came back to Australia, and I've been running Safetrac for 14 years. So I've been in compliance now for 14 years.
Wow, you started when you were 18.
That's
incredible.
Right, I did. So I'm almost going to go with veteran now.
Right.
But the interesting thing about compliance is it's always changing.
Yeah.
So you could be an expert in compliance 10 years ago and come back in today and you wouldn't understand any of what's going on in the compliance space. It is a constant evolving space.
And have you noticed a cultural shift as well, where it's become not more popular, but certainly more of a hot topic?
Oh, massive. I've seen a seismic shift in compliance from where we started 14 years ago. And literally there might have been one person working in an organisation. They were usually shoved in a basement back then and nobody listened to them. And now we've seen them elevated to high-level board positions. And we've seen what I would only term as the rise of compliance, where it's now the critical lifeblood of an organisation's health, really. And, we've sort of seen various topics, whether it be privacy, cybersecurity, the Me Too movement, absolutely huge. I think the COVID pandemic and all of the mental health consequences that were stemmed from that and working from home, we've seen some really big shifts in the workplace, and our compliance obligations, especially in Australia, have really increased quite significantly. And we've got a large raft of new laws that many companies are coming to terms with. So I actually really like the juxtaposition of yourself coming into this saying, what is all this space? What's all this about? And me sort of knowing what I'm talking about.
I would hope so.
I don't like to be vain in all these things because compliance is an evolving journey.
Yeah.
I don't feel like you're ever there. I don't think you ever know anything. It's as much as about being vigilant and aware and constantly evolving as it is about being an expert on any particular thing.
Just in the short time that I've been working for Safetrac, there's been legislation changes and updates while I've been working here within 6 months, which is utterly insane for getting things changed. So you do have to have your finger on the pulse. Things are evolving.
Yep. It'd be good to talk about mental health and psychosocial. And I jotted down a few stats that I thought we could utilise.
Some stats?
I love a few stats.
Oh, beautiful.
So according to Safe Work Australia, mental health conditions accounted for 9% of all serious workers' compensation claims in 2021 to 2022, a notable 36.9% increase since 2017 to 18.
Wow.
But the really important thing about these claims is they tend to be very costly. Okay. And the median compensation claim paid for those mental health conditions was over $58,000 per claim, and that's compared to $15,500 for all other types of injuries. So, in addition,
that's a big difference.
It's a huge difference.
Wow.
So you're talking quick maths, 5 times the amount of an average claim. And importantly, they also led to significantly more time off work.
Yeah. Okay.
So the median time lost was over 4 times higher than those for physical injuries.
Christ.
So you're talking about claims that are much more serious from a monetary point of view, but also from an impact to your workplace point of view.
Yeah.
So you're talking about really serious things that our workplaces are now responsible for ensuring that we do something about them.
So I've heard the term positive duty thrown around. Does that apply here as well?
It does.
Okay.
But we then start to mix up the respect at work laws.
Okay, right.
And the positive duty is part of the respect at work laws. It's a different set of laws to the work safe laws.
Okay.
And when we're talking about workplace health and safety and psychosocial health, sexual harassment is part of that, in that obviously being sexually harassed in the workplace can impact your mental health.
Yep.
So they're part of those claims. But for you to be necessarily compliant with your workplace, with your safe workplace obligations, will not necessarily mean that you would meet the requirements of the respect at work positive duty requirements. Okay. So there are definitely different standards and things that you need to be doing differently in order to meet.
And this is where 14 years of experience shows itself over 6 months.
Look, to be honest, this space is quite complicated, and I think a lot of people that are experts in the space have found themselves quite confused by how these laws interplay and interact with each other.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll try and sort a little bit of that out today.
Yeah.
But maybe we go with asking, setting out, what a psychosocial hazard is.
I've got some idea of what a psychosocial hazard would be, but in terms of the actual law and what's written in the guidance, I wouldn't be able to guess.
What do you guess?
So anything that's going to cause someone some sort of mental harm, so abuse or bullying, harassment, whether that's sexual or otherwise, that sort of thing. But this is me picking things out of the air.
No, it's a great place to start, and they definitely form part of it. It's anything really that can create a hazard to somebody's mental health. So that could be high workloads.
Yep.
It could be high stress loads, and some of the more obvious things that you mentioned. So anything that has the capacity to harm somebody's mental health. Things like discrimination and harassment are really big parts of those, but so is actually the way that the organisation actually responds to those things.
Okay.
So most workplaces from time to time will have a high stress load, for example, but if an employee comes to a workplace and says, look, I'm feeling really stressed, and the organisation goes, bad luck, suck it up, go back to work, that might be different than someone says, oh, that's no good, I'm sorry you're feeling that way, make sure you utilise your leave to take a day, or do you need some extra time, or take a day in lieu, or what is it that I can do to help you and support you Do we have an ERP in place? What are we going to do to support that worker through those issues? So it's not just simply eliminating as much as possible some of those issues from the workplace, but it's how the workplace is going to go about supporting someone.
From an employer's perspective, what exactly would they have to do in order to make sure that people's psychosocial health is being taken care of and they are compliant and following the guidance?
Yeah. So under the laws within Australia, employers are required to do several things. First of all, they need to be able to identify potential psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So what are there? What are the things that could happen to a worker? What are the things that might create mental stress or hazards to workers? That might be a whole raft of things, and depending on the workplace, they're probably going to be largely different. So looking at what one workplace has is probably going to be quite different from looking at your own. So it's really important you look at your own workplace and the individual groups and the types of hazards and stresses that are involved in each of those different teams. We then need to assess what those risks and hazards are and what is the potential impact or harm to employees. So what could, let's say I'm working in a professional services firm and there's just a constant ongoing stress load all the time. What is the potential hazards to those staff members as a result of that? And then we need to look at implementing control measures to address that. So what do those control measures look like? It might be providing training, it might be adjusting workloads, it might be improving workplace communications, it might be increasing staffing levels, might be a raft of different things that we need to do. And then in terms of what we really need to do for all compliance initiatives is we need to review the effectiveness of those controls on an ongoing and continuous basis. And of course, we always need to be training our staff in what they need to be doing in these things, how they can identify, how they can report. If they are feeling these things, where can they report that to? That workplace is going to take those reports seriously, that they're going to do it about the employee feels supported. All of those things are very important.
And so going back to the training part, obviously we're quite a big part of that is Safetrac. How often should people be doing this training? Obviously things are changing quite often. Yeah.
Look, regular and ongoing training is what is required by most regulators these days. What is regular and ongoing training? A one-off on induction and tick and flick, not okay. Nope. Never going to cut it. Yep. So regular should be annual. It might not be the same training annually. It might be it might be a mix. It might be, some sort of training one year, another type another year. Constant reinforcement of messaging is really important, supported and backed up by policies. As soon as there's legislative change or regulatory change that impacts the training that you've given, the policies that you've got, that you refresh and you renew that, you make sure the staff are aware of it. And it is a pretty constantly evolving space at the moment. So ensuring that we're up to date and up to speed with the law as it changes from time to time is really important.
And that's important for cultural change as well. Consistency is always important. To affect any sort of change across a business. Yeah. So in the case that someone is struggling with their psychosocial health, what sort of support should be given by that employer to their staff?
So again, it's going to depend on the injury that's been claimed or the issue that they're suffering, but we would be looking at healthcare and social assistance, access to an EAP.
Yes. Okay.
Employment assistance program.
Yep.
I know we hate acronyms here.
Yeah. I mean, so we have acronym busting, don't we?
We do.
Culturally at Safetrac. So I'm a marketer.
Yep.
Marketing is absolutely rife with it. Yeah. Horrendous. And I get called out quite a lot for
Look, there's lots of them in compliance also. Yeah. So whenever I say one, I'll
point it out, and we can maybe have a little thing on the screen saying EAP,
yes, EAP, Employee Assistance Program. Yes, and often they have a raft of support services, whether it's psychological, and staff members can be exposed to a range of stress. It might be financial, might be legal, and most of those programs should be able to support you in a range of those things. It's not just psychological.
And does it have to be work-related, sorry?
No, it doesn't.
No?
Sometimes workers are going to come with their own stresses that affects their ability to perform in a workplace. So a lot of those EAPs will actually support them through those non-work-related stresses. But for the purpose of this podcast, we are talking about psychosocial hazards, which are hazards that they're experiencing in the workplace. Okay. So we want to make sure that they do support those. Education and training is critical. So ensuring that staff understand what a workplace's duties towards the staff member are and to the law in terms of how they comply with the law is actually critical.
Yeah.
I think we've all probably heard the saying that ignorance is no excuse to the law. As
absolutely.
an individual complying with the law, you can't say, sorry, officer, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to steal. It's never going to fly, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking speeding in my head, but stealing.
Yep.
Same.
Same with compliance in a workplace. The law is the law, and saying, I'm sorry, there's so many laws I didn't know that I had to be compliant with them, or I didn't know about this as a law. It's never going to cut it.
Yep.
So ignorance is not an excuse, and in fact, training is probably your best friend. A lot of workplaces, when I started Safetrac, we used to get a lot of resistance. I don't want to train my staff because if they know about it, then I'll have to be compliant in it.
Okay. Yeah.
You actually have to be compliant with it, whether your staff know about it or not.
Yep.
And in actual fact, the best thing for you is training. That means staff understood what your obligations are and what their obligations are, so that if they notice something's wrong, they can actually come to you and say, hey, this isn't right, and you've got an opportunity to fix that. You've got an opportunity to put a control in place and to amend what it is that's wrong before you end up in the front page of the paper for all the wrong reasons.
Yep.
So that's why training and education is really so important for them to protect their own self and your workplace. Then we've got things like specific things that might be in various different industries. So depending on the industry that you're in, may have different risks associated with it. So if you're in construction and you've got very, very tight deadlines to meet a finish line on a building work, there might be very, very high levels of stress associated with that. There may also be a lot of late night works to get it done on time. So there's some real hazards and stress associated with that. And unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with that deadline. It's not like you can change the contract. So how are you going to support and how are you going to meet any potential risks that are in there? It might be adding on additional resources. So things like that, identifying specific things for specific industries. The finance sector, which is a huge sector for us. I think they started the whole compliance game. In Australia, at least, they were the first industry to really, they need their financial services compliance requirements met in order to obtain and maintain their licences. So financial services has always been very, very big for Safetrac, but we've seen a real growth in compliance, construction, retail, manufacturing, mining, really big growth in those industries. But high performance expectations in these industries can be a real risk to those workers. So needing to sign a certain amount of contracts, a certain amount of insurances, things like that can create high stress levels. And in the past has created need for people to maybe engage in conduct that wasn't necessarily ethical. So looking at some of those pressures and working out whether they're realistic and necessary are things that workplaces.
It's quite interesting thinking about mining and construction, these sorts of industries, versus financial, legal, professional services, etc. You would almost be forgiven for thinking there's not as many psychosocial issues as there are physical, because you immediately jump to tight deadlines, got to make sure people are wearing hard hats, abiding by all the safety rules. But you would be forgiven for skipping over the psychosocial stuff. But actually, it's probably just as important for preventing injury or, as we saw from the stats at the start, some pretty hefty fines or compensation.
The other interesting one, I think, is retail. The retail was interesting because a lot of the stresses that they face are actually external to the organisation. They're not maybe what's being created internally in the workplace. It's more external. So it might be customers. It might be bullying customers. Might be customers coming and being rude. Abuse. These sort of things. So they're sort of things that the organisation can't necessarily control. So how are you going to support your staff in those sort of circumstances?
Really interesting. I spent some time in retail, and obviously it was a while ago. It wasn't last week, but I can imagine. I can remember. There's some pretty horrific things happened and some nasty abuse thrown, and I felt supported. I think I was lucky to work in an environment where my managers did care. But I could imagine if you weren't supported, I certainly wasn't doing any, there wasn't any education or training or anything around psychosocial back then. This must be going back 10, 15 years now.
Yeah.
I think I was lucky, but I would imagine pretty nasty place to work if...
Well, that support piece you mentioned is critical in how we're going to deal with a workplace that identifies those as the type of hazard that they're going to face. Yeah. So, I mean, you can only train your staff so much. You can say, we won't tolerate certain sorts of conduct, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Yep.
So it's going to become about what's going to happen if it does happen. Yep. So what are we going to do with the staff member that, experienced or was subjected to that? How are we going to support them? What are we going to do? Is it, is there going to be counselling given? Are they going to be given additional support to feel supported? What's actually going to happen as a result of that? We need to make sure that staff member feels empowered to report that so that they can get the necessary support in return.
Very interesting.
And another one that we've certainly seen in terms of external controls is sexual harassment.
Yes.
We see it a lot in the hospitality industry, for example. Often has large experiences of sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is one of the elements of psychosocial hazards that we see. And that's a lovely segue, Craig,
for
us to introduce our extraordinary guest for today. So we're thrilled to welcome today Dr. Anna Cody, who is Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. She was appointed to that role in 2023. So she is absolutely a preeminent expert in this space.
Yep.
Dr. Cody, or Commissioner Cody, had a distinguished career as a lawyer and an academic, specialising in discrimination, and is a passionate advocate for human rights.
Yep.
Dr. Cody was previously the Dean of Law School and a professor at the University of Western Sydney, and she was there for 4.5 years. And in her role there, she led the educational and research impact within the school in relation to diversity, in relation to the community and the intersection of law and justice. So she's absolutely a preeminent expert in this space. And she has done a lot of work with the AHRC in relation to the recent Respect at Work laws. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation with Commissioner Cody this afternoon about the intersection of the Respect at Work laws and sexual harassment with the psychosocial hazards and work health safety laws in this area. Commissioner Cody, as part of this webinar today, podcast today, what we are doing is we're talking about the very hot topic of psychosocial health and hazards in the workplace, and a very critical one of those, and one that's been very prevalent and talked about a lot over the last 12, 24 months, is the new Respect at Work legislation and sexual harassment, the Respect at Work laws, and how they interplay with the psychosocial health laws. I'm wondering if you could maybe give an introduction to the part that they play within this body of laws.
Certainly, and such a pleasure to join you today. So the reason why we have the new laws, particularly around positive duty under the Sex Discrimination Act, are because of a national inquiry that the Australian Human Rights Commission ran. And that national inquiry looked at the experience of sexual harassment across the workplace. And what it found is that 1 in 3 workers over the last 5 years have experienced sexual harassment, and that rate is even higher for particular groups of workers. So, for example, First Nations workers, young people, LGBTQI plus workers, culturally, racially marginalised workers experience sexual harassment at even higher rates. So some of the recommendations that came out of our national inquiry included, rather than waiting for and having the responsibility on the complainant for making a complaint, actually recognising that workplaces needed to take responsibility for preventing and eliminating sexual harassment and other forms of unlawful conduct from our workplaces. So that's where the Respect at Work change came from, is that now all businesses, all employers have that responsibility to eliminate as far as possible to all the forms of unlawful action. So that's sexual harassment, sex discrimination, victimisation, hostile work environment on the basis of sex. For those forms of unlawful action, a business has to take reasonable and proportionate steps. The relationship with work health and safety, there's an overlap, because we know that sexual harassment has harms attached to it, and many of those harms are psychosocial harms. But the relationship with work health and safety is that those laws focus on safety at work. So there's physical safety as well as psychological safety. And there's a now growing understanding, as you highlighted, of how important it is to keep workers psychologically safe within a workplace, to manage risks, to think about it in that context. But within a respect at work framework, the aim of these laws is gender equality, is to ensure that women can participate fully within the workplace in an equal way, and to prevent sexual harassment. So it's not so much, so sometimes there will be an overlap in the actions that an employer may take, but the aim of the laws are slightly different.
Yes, I think you're hitting on a critical point, and it was going to be one of my next questions to you. And that is, we see a lot of organisations come to us and they'll say they want to do some training in psychosocial hazards and health for their workplace, and they want it to address sexual harassment, and that therefore they will have met their obligations under the Respect at Work legislation by doing that. And our response to that is that that would not adequately meet the requirements that they have to meet the positive duty to do a small component of a work health and safety course that touches on sexual harassment. Could you give me your thoughts on that topic and how you think how that would go towards meeting their obligations?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're dead right that just having a small component of a psychosocial training on sexual harassment would not be enough to meet those obligations under the positive duty. So we have, the Australian Human Rights Commission has got some really fantastic resources. We've got guidelines which we have published for all different sizes of businesses, and they outline 7 standards that an employer has to comply with. So one of them is education. So you have to educate your workforce about what is the positive duty, what are the requirements. And education isn't just a one-off. You need to do it when you're inducting workers, and then you need to do it on a regular basis. So one of the things that we've heard about, we've just recently been doing consultations on sexual harassment, is that often there'll be a one-off e-learning type of education module, but then it never gets revisited. Whereas other areas, such as work health and safety, get revisited on a weekly, monthly basis. So you need to be revisiting sexual harassment training on a regular basis. You also need to have leadership. So how is your leadership actually involved? Your CEO, your board of directors, how are they demonstrating their commitment to eliminating those forms of unlawful action, so the sexual harassment, sex discrimination. Then also a part of leadership is creating a culture, a really strong culture where people are able, bystanders, that concept of active bystanders is very prevalent, so that people will speak out and support people within the workplace. And then also making sure that there's that knowledge level across the business, and then taking that risk management approach to sexual harassment. Then there's also monitoring and evaluation of what measures have been taken and how effective they are, and support, making sure that the reporting and support for people when they do report experiences of sexual harassment or sex discrimination or the hostile work environment, that's dealt with really effectively.
Yep. Well, I would certainly echo that the resources that have been produced by the AHRC are superb, and they are an excellent guidance, an excellent starting point for anybody wanting to start out in looking at this. Commissioner, what would your advice be if you were speaking to an organisation or a director that hadn't heard of this legislation and doesn't know anything about the positive duty? Aside from your website, where else would you be directing them, and what would be your advice to that person in relation to that? Because we hear this a lot.
So I would say it's good to go first to our website just to look at what's required. So those 7 standards, and there's some really clear practical things that an organisation can do. But then one of the key parts of what actions are we going to take is consulting with your workforce. So one of the very first steps that any manager would do is actually possibly doing a range of consultations. So that might be a survey, that might be face-to-face conversations, team meetings, to find out what is their experience within the workplace and what are some of the measures that those workers would suggest as ways of dealing with these issues within the workplace. So consulting with your workforce is one of the key steps in actually dealing with sexual harassment or sex discrimination. And then the education, like absolutely, there's some really great resources around about sexual harassment. There's resources on our website, but there's also resources on our Watch website, on Full Stop. Safetrac as well may have some resources on their website. So all of those things are free, available. So making sure that you educate at different levels of the business about what is sexual harassment, because we've been doing these consultations, and one of the things that's been really surprising to us is actually the lack of knowledge even around what is sexual harassment. People often get confused and think that sexual assault, which is physical touching, is what sexual harassment is. And in fact, sexual harassment is a broader range of behaviour. So it's all of those unwanted sexual jokes, propositioning for sex, comments about someone's sexual self, all of those things. And then also the way it interlays with, say, if someone's from a culturally diverse background, making comments about, how using stereotypes about a particular culture. So Latina women is a very common stereotype around their sexuality. So absolutely understanding the ways in which sexual harassment happens within a workplace is one of those key.
Yeah, the survey
steps.
one I think is really critical. One that we have some involvement in and that we do surveying on behalf of clients. One of the interesting feedbacks we got on a survey recently was that the directors were most interested in how their survey benchmarked against other companies and how their results compared to other companies' results. And our response to them was that it didn't really matter how their results benchmarked to other businesses. It was a matter of benchmarking those results against their own business, in that this survey was for them to see and identify issues in their own organisation that they then needed to address, and then rerun the survey in, say, 6 months' time after they'd done some controls to address those issues, and then rerun the survey and benchmark survey 1 against survey 2 and see some improvement, and that some of those areas at least had shown improvement and been addressed. Do you have a comment or a thought on that process? Do you think it is useful that they compare them to other companies, or do you really think it's about improving their own environment?
Well, I think comparing different surveys to each other is impossible. It doesn't actually give you comparable data. So even the very beginning step of that is not going to work as an adequate comparison. I know that the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, their data you can compare. So in terms of gender pay gap, that's comparable data. But different surveys around the experience of sexual harassment is not going to be comparable. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've met the standard that you have to comply with the positive duty, because each business is judged on itself. What is a reasonable and proportionate response? So what's adequate for one business is not adequate for another, because that business may have more employees, have more resources, be a different type of business, might be a mine rather than a shop, might be a chain of businesses or an individual standalone business. So what's adequate for one is absolutely not adequate for another. So you really do have to come up with a tailored response. And there can be different survey instruments that you can use, but that doesn't mean that your survey would be the same as someone else's survey.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that some of the weaknesses was around identification of types of sexual harassment, because we've certainly seen that echoed in our survey responses as the types of sexual harassment, and people are unaware of what sexual harassment actually constitutes. So we've certainly seen that in our results as well.
I've actually got a question myself, if that's okay. Yeah. So there's obviously going to be a difference coming back to the surveys and comparing against other businesses. There's likely to be a difference in industries, and where certain male-dominated industries, you might think that they're probably going to be a higher prevalence of sexual harassment or discrimination. But there are other industries that maybe, could I say, might be resting on their laurels, or might think they don't have a problem, so they don't need to look as hard. I'd imagine that's probably not the case, and they probably also need to be looking just as hard at their own businesses, where they may not even realise that they're not following the guidelines or what they should be.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that sadly, sexual harassment is prevalent across all Australian workplaces. There are high incidences in particular industries, and where there is a male-dominated workforce, then there is a high incidence. And also, for example, in mining, in construction, there is a higher incidence. But we've also just heard recently in some research done in the retail industry, which is a more female-dominated workforce, but actually the incidence of sexual harassment is quite high because it comes from customers as well as co-workers and supervisors and managers. So absolutely no industry, sadly, does not have this experience within it. And I think as well, we need to think broadly. If we think about the experience of LGBTQI plus workers within a workplace, how that can also play out. So men experience sexual harassment often from other men, and we know that there's particular steps that a business needs to take in order to deal with that.
Thank you.
It's along your theme, Craig. Our favourite resistance to taking on respect at work or sexual harassment training is that we don't have any reported incidents in our workplace. It's not a problem for us.
And very sadly, we know that so many people don't come forward because they don't feel supported. Only 18% in our last survey, 18% of all those who experienced it actually made a formal report.
That's insane.
Oftentimes, people don't know where to go, or they get a resistant response or a minimising type of response, or but he's just like that. Oh, but that's just him. And that completely trivialising type of response is really harmful. So that sort of management response really needs to be dealt with and eliminated from the workplace. But we know that that's why we've got the positive duty, is to make sure that employers take some of that proactive.
It might not surprise you to learn that statement was recently made to me by a merchant banking organisation that has a purely male leadership ranking, not a single female in their senior ranks. But they don't have a sexual harassment problem there, which is great.
Yeah. And one of the other things that came out of our recent consultations is how important it is to have diversity in leadership. Yep. So making sure that there are men, women, people of all genders in leadership, but also culturally, racially marginalised people within leadership, that diversity, not only does it strengthen and make more profitable an organisation or a business, but it actually enables some of these entrenched behaviours get eliminated and stopped within an organisation.
Perfect.
I've got two other questions.
Just conscious of time. Do you are you running out or?
No, I think we've got another 5 minutes or so.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So one that we have a lot is from people who work within rigid hierarchies. I'm not going to name names of organisations, but let's just go with rigid hierarchies, where you may have consultants come into workplaces with very high levels of qualifications, and they're brought in to do procedures or a type of work in an organisation. They're not actually an employee of the hospital, and they actually bring a lot of work. Oh, I said hospital.
I'd already thought that, but anyway.
Am I allowed to pinpoint?
I mean,
I try not to. What do you think?
It can be edited out. It's fine. I mean, it actually occurs across. It's not just hospitals.
Yeah, but we've been the recipient of a number of calls from people who have suffered harassment within institutions of rigid hierarchies, where people are called in as consultants. The organisation can't afford to not utilise that person because they actually bring in a lot of revenue to that organisation, but the person refuses to comply with directions in relation to certain work behaviours. What would be your recommendations if those behaviours are outside of the standards that organisation generally accepts, but they sort of feel beholden to that person because without that person they actually suffer significant financial loss, which can actually affect the whole organisation? How do you think that they can go about making some changes and working with those difficulties?
I think that the organisation has to have a long, hard look at itself because what is it that gives it social licence to operate? And it is that it has particular values and that it upholds the law. So it's not upholding the law, it's operating in an illegal way if it doesn't ensure that sexual harassment is not allowed to thrive in an organisation. And it's also, if it's a short-term gain, really, because if anyone were to bring a claim against a high-profile person working within an organisation, then that would be both reputationally very harmful and also financially very harmful. So you can't assume that a claim isn't going to be forthcoming, and that can go to a very large impact on a business. But it's also from a moral standpoint, that's no longer acceptable as a way of operating. As a society, we've recognised that we actually want to create workplaces that allow everyone to contribute fully, and that means that we can't have sex discrimination and sexual harassment in operating.
So it starts always at the top in terms of our leadership and the standards that our organisation's prepared to uphold. And then that needs to, of course, filter down to the organisation through a variety of methodologies, whether that be policies, procedures, reporting mechanisms, support. Where do you think they need to start?
So I think leaders need to educate themselves. There are some great places to start to learn about the nature of sexual harassment. Looking at some of the resources on our website is a really important place to start. But also recognising the wisdom within your workforce, talking to them about their experience, recognising that there are diverse people within a workforce, and so making sure that you hear from all groups within a community of a workplace, and making sure that you demonstrate. It is absolutely, leadership is what creates a culture within an organisation. So making sure that you speak up, that you educate, and that you enable other people within your organisation to also stand up for particular values within your organisation. And that also means upholding the law. And the law is positive duty, and that's a duty to eliminate as far as possible sexual harassment, sex discrimination and hostile work environments.
And I'm sure your advice would be the same to this type of organisation, but it's a quite different problem, and that is a problem within voluntary organisations that are staffed by large volumes of voluntary workers that couldn't possibly exist without that very large volunteer base, and how they actually get them trained and compliant with the new laws, and how they get them to do that and comply with the laws and still want to work there and volunteer their time. Do you have any advice for those sort of organisations?
I think that all volunteers are doing a service for the community, and so they're wanting to do the best that they can for the particular organisation. So if it's framed in that way, that this is now a new requirement, in the same way that wearing a helmet in some construction sites, that's a requirement. People just have to comply, they comply. Same with smoking. We don't smoke at work anymore. So that's a compliance aspect. Same with sexual harassment. We don't sexually harass at work. That's not okay. So framing it in those ways of making sure that volunteers are educated, and it's actually a skilling them up about what are the new legal requirements, making sure that they know. So it's it's a professional development for them. It's valuing them and making sure that they can contribute in a way that's valuable to the organisation.
I actually really like that new analogy.
I love that, yeah.
It's your new hard hat, isn't it?
Well, and with smoking as well, it's a cultural thing.
Absolutely.
Because if everyone's on board, at all levels within an organisation that smoking is unhealthy or wearing a hard hat is required, you're going to call out your peers, and peer pressure is going to eliminate it from your organisation. Obviously, it's not going to be overnight, but I think probably it's a great analogy for sex discrimination and harassment.
I see some new posters.
I see posters. Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing your posters. But it shows just how widespread our understanding is of physical safety and how we haven't thought about it in the impact that actually is longer term often is psychosocial safety.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've very much enjoyed this discussion, your wisdom and your thoughts on these topics. Commissioner Cody, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate your time and it's lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Well, that was really educational. Really appreciated Dr. Cody coming on the podcast, Commissioner Cody coming on our podcast to speak all things respect at work and how it intersects with psychosocial health. I certainly learned a few things. So
it's your gig to find our next guest.
It is, yes. Or yours,
or mine.
You could find our next guest.
We could advertise for volunteers.
What I would say is to our audience, I'm speaking directly to those down the camera. Anyone who would be interested in talking to us about certain aspects of compliance doesn't necessarily need to be limited to psychosocial health or.
Especially, we've done this.
Absolutely. So anything compliance, then definitely get in touch. Also, if you are a member of the audience who is a business leader in HR, in compliance, in risk, who has any specific questions about areas of compliance that either Deb could answer or we could get answered by one of the fantastic staff who have got a huge amount of experience in this field at Safetrac. And also any special guests that we might be able to bring to the podcast too.
Yeah, I'd love this to be sort of like a Dear Deb, like, Dear Abby, and people would do, their questions. We could do that.
We absolutely could do that. But I fear that we'd get some questions that aren't necessarily related to compliance.
No, that's the only ones we're taking.
They're the only ones we're taking.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So if anyone wants relationship advice, that's where we draw the line. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Look forward to the next one.